welcome everyone. I'm so happy that you're joining me today. So let's jump right in. We only have an hour. So Jakob already introduced CareerFoundry. A little bit about me. I am a CareerFoundry graduate. I started studying UX with CareerFoundry in 2017. And currently I'm working as a product designer at Zalando. And today I'm going to teach you some of the fundamental parts about UX design, which is user interviews. Now, what will we learn today? We'll talk about the why, the when, and the how about user interviews. We'll talk a little bit about user research, about the differences between surveys and user research. And then I'll go into a very hands-on part of this webinar where I'll teach you how to write research goals, research questions, how to write an interview guide, and I'll also give you some tips on how to conduct a user interview. And then near the end, we'll have a live user interview where you can see all the things that I'll teach you, put into practice. And of course, in the end, we'll also have some time for your questions. So if you have any, then note them down. We can answer those near the end. So first off, let's talk a bit about user interviews. Now, user interviews are a part of a bigger element of UX design, which is called user research. And you have two different kinds of user research. You have the qualitative part and the quantitative part. And the qualitative user research focuses on the why. So user interviews are a part of qualitative user research, and they try to find out the motivations and the behaviors of your users. Whereas quantitative research focuses way more on how many. So in that case, you're talking about statistics, about surveys, and it's less about what people think, but how many people think a certain thing. Now, you can conduct user research during the whole design thinking process, but there are 2 points where it's very important. First off, in the beginning of the design thinking process, where you're trying to understand your user, where you're trying to empathize with your user. And this is also the moment where user interviews are really important. Then near the end of the design thinking process, when you have a prototype and you want to test this is also an important point to talk with your users. And you will probably do that in what we call a usability test. So in that case, you will have a prototype that you want to get tested and you're asking for feedback from your users. And to show you the complexity of user research, I show this image that I got from the NN group, which shows a whole overview of all the kinds of user research that exists. So user interviews are only one method that you can use, and that's the one that we'll be focusing on today. But you also have A/B testing, eye tracking, you have interviews that are with people at home. So there are many different ways on how you can connect with your users and better understand them. Now, the benefits of qualitative research, they're very important to know, especially when you're starting to work in companies that are data-driven, that are driven by numbers. There might be criticism about qualitative research because they're not expressed in numbers. So why would you need qualitative research? Like I already said before, qualitative research really helps us to understand the why of our users. It helps us to understand behaviors, motivations, and opinions. And this is something that cannot be expressed in numbers, but it is really essential to how people experience, for example, an app or a website. And the good thing about qualitative research and user interviews in particular is that they allow room for follow-up questions. When you're doing a survey, you just send out the survey to many different people and you don't have the chance to talk to them personally. And when you're doing a user interview, you do have the chance to talk with them personally. So you do have the chance to dig deeper and to ask follow-up questions. And another benefit of user interviews compared to surveys is that you only need few people. So it's already sufficient to talk with, for example, 5 different people, whereas with a survey, you have to reach out to many different people, thousands of people, to get a statistically correct number. Now, I already talked a bit about what the differences are between user interviews and surveys, but to summarize them once again, a survey is a more generic insight from a big group of people. You're getting statistics like 60% of people like a red button, or 75% think this and that. And that's the benefit of a survey. It's unmoderated. So you create a survey and you send that out to many different people. And that generates less time upfront because you just sent out the survey and you don't have to take care of it at that moment. People can just answer it. It's asynchronous. Whereas with user interviews, you have to invest time. You have to actually talk with these people. You have to prepare an interview guide. So this is way more time intensive. Now, the cons of surveys is that you don't have a chance to ask follow-up questions. So you have to make sure that the questions that you ask in your survey, they're well thought out, because you won't have the chance to moderate it later on. And another thing that is related to that is that in a survey, you don't have the chance to ask for explanations. So if someone gives an ambiguous answer, it's really hard to understand what they mean because you don't have that personal contact like you would in user interviews. Now, before you start with a user interview, it's really important to understand the goal of your research. So never just jump into an interview and think of some questions that you want to get answered. It takes a bit of preparation work, and it all starts with a research goal. The research goal is the purpose of your research. It answers the question, why are we doing this? So it explains the reasons why you're conducting the research. And these research goals are important because it helps you reflect on the purpose. It also helps you to define the scope. It helps you to know what you want to measure and how these insights can be turned into actions. It also helps you to know the why and the what before deciding on the how. So, what might happen is that you think about a research goal, you define the scope, you know what you want to find out, what the purpose is, and then you come to the conclusion that user interviews might not be the right method for this purpose. And that is why it is so important to start from the goal and not start from the method. Always let the goal lead the method that you're going to use. And another important hint here is that a research goal is never formulated as a question. So it's formulated as a sentence. For example, in the case that we're going to use today, we're going to talk about a dating app. So the purpose of a user interview that we conduct in this context might be, we are doing this research because we want to find out how people meet new people or potential love matches via dating apps, instead of a question that could be, how do people use dating apps? That's not a research goal. That is a research question. So, in combination with the research goal, you also want to define research questions. These are the questions that explain what are you trying to find out. So, what do you intend to learn? And these questions are not the ones that you would ask your users, but it's more the ones that you would ask yourself. So, in combination with the research goal, what is it that we intend to learn? What is it that we want to find out? And these research questions, they help with writing an interview guide later on. And they also help with finding the right people and, again, the right methods. So, again, instead of thinking we're going to do a user interview and already jumping into the questions that you want to ask your users, you're first going to take a step back and think about, what is the purpose and what do we intend to learn? And these research questions, they oftentimes begin with how, blah, blah, blah. In which way, what, why, to what extent. So, when you're trying to come up with research questions, try to begin the question with why, and then what you intend to learn, to what extent, and then what you intend to learn. I'll give you an example later on when we start with the live interview. I will guide you through the research goals and research questions so that you get a bit of a feeling of how that might work. Now, when you find out the research goals and the research questions, you're halfway there. The research goals and the research questions help you to identify the method that you're going to use. So, in this case, today, the method will be a user interview. And it also helps you to identify which kind of people would I like to talk to. So, they give you requirements for the screening of people. And this is very important because not all users are the same. When you're doing a user interview, you might want to think about a certain segment, a certain group of your users. And this group needs to be relevant to the research goals. So, for example, for our dating app, that is the use case that we'll be using today, the group of people that might be relevant are people working in tech, people between 20 and 45, people that have used dating apps before. And this group is not always exactly one-on-one the same as your whole user group. It can be a part of that, a smaller part. Now, when you have your research goals, your research questions, you know that you want to conduct a user interview, you even already found people that you want to interview, then it's time to write an interview guide. And this guide is kind of like an outline of all the questions that you would like to ask your users. And it is very important that this guide does not contain 45 questions or a gigantic number of questions. Because oftentimes, when you're doing a user interview, it will take maximum an hour. I've only once been in a user interview that took longer, that took 1.5 hours. And that was only because we were very deeply diving into the psychology of our users. But normally, interviews are between 30 minutes and an hour. So you need to be mindful of that. You won't have the time to ask 45 questions. So, what I would recommend is that you formulate 5 to 10 questions, the most important things that you want to find out. And the reason why you should limit the key questions is because you want to allow yourself some room for follow up questions. Because an interview should feel like a conversation. And imagine when you're talking to a friend of yours, you might have some idea of what you want to talk about. You might have some idea on what you want to ask your friend. But what makes the conversation are the follow up questions that come naturally. So you need to calculate time for that. So when you write these key questions, always make sure that they refer back to your research goal and your research questions. So use your research goal and your research questions as a foundation for that. So to summarize, key questions are the most important questions that you want to ask your user, your interviewee. Now, when you want to write your interview guide, there are many different ways how you can do this. And you don't need any fancy tools for that. I've always just used Google Docs or Microsoft Word or Pages. You don't need any fancy tool to write your interview guide. But what is really helpful, especially when you're a beginner and you're going to prepare your first interview guide, is to what I would like to do, write down a whole script. Write down what do you want to say. So think about an introduction. Think about your key questions. Think about some follow up questions that you might want to ask. And also don't forget to end the interview in the end. Now, when you've written all those outlines, they're meant for you to be a guide, not a script. And to give you an example of this, right now I've written down everything that I want to tell you today, but I'm not looking at my interview guide or my script. I just use that as some memory in my mind, as something to hold on to. But I try to keep that natural, and I try to keep that guide as a anchor point, but not as a script. And the reason why this is important is that when you're going to read your whole interview guide, I have it open here in front of me, you're going to sound like a robot. You don't have time anymore to have this natural conversation. So try to prepare as well as you can, but then also be okay with letting it go. You don't have to follow everything word by word. It is just there for you as an anchor point. Now, like I already said before, leave room for follow up questions. And one thing that I really had to practice, but now that I know really helps me, is to ask why 5 times. And the first time that you try this out, that might sound a little bit unnatural because you're asking your interviewee, why? Why did you think this? But why and why? But this really helps you to get to the core of what someone is telling you. It really helps you to understand their motivations and their opinions. Now, what you also want to do, and this might be a bit tricky if you're writing your first interview guide, is to avoid yes no questions. So avoid closed questions. And you want to avoid leading questions. What do I mean with that? Of course, in the flow of a conversation, you might ask one or two closed questions, but don't use a key question as a closed question. So, for example, a closed question in our use case of dating apps could be, do you like Tinder? Your user can only say yes or no to that. And the problem with this is that if I would ask you, do you like Tinder? And you say no, then I'm already kind of, the flow already kind of stopped. So what you can do instead is asking, what kind of dating apps do you use? This invites the interviewee to really answer and think about that question deeply. And it really starts the conversation. It gives you way more room to ask follow-up questions later on. Now, what you also want to avoid are leading questions, or how I would call them, questions that have an assumption. For example, a leading question could be, what is it that you hate about Tinder? The reason why that is a leading question is because I assume you don't like Tinder. And the role of us as interviewers during the user interview is to be neutral. We don't want to give our user or our interviewee the feeling that we're judging them. We want to create an open space where ideally they are doing most of the talking, and we're only guiding them with asking a question just sometimes, but we want to hear them talk most of all. So try to ask questions that aren't leading. For example, instead of asking, what makes you hate Tinder? You can ask, what's your experience using dating apps? This helps your interviewee to tell themselves, oh, I have a negative experience using dating apps or have a positive experience. And then that allows you to ask more. Why is that your experience? What makes you feel like that? How could the experience be positive? What could have made the experience be less positive? So, to summarize, you want to formulate some key questions that you use as a foundation, and they are there to act as anchor points, as guidelines throughout your interview. And what you're trying to accomplish is that your interviewee is doing most of the talking, and you're just there to kind of steer them. And you do that steering by asking open questions that don't have assumptions in them. Now comes the exciting part, which is, what do you do when you have to conduct the actual user interview? And I can tell you, the first times that I was doing a user interview, I was so nervous. It was nerve-wracking for me because I was so anxious to maybe forget a question or react in a negative way. And I was really stressed, especially because I'm someone that sometimes needs to go over a hurdle to talk to new people. If you're an introvert, I'm also an introvert, then you might know this feeling of, oh, I now have to talk to someone I've never met and I want to make a good impression. And on top of that, you're interviewing them. So that makes it even more challenging. So here are some things that really helped me. And I have to say, the most important thing is that you feel comfortable with time. The first time I did a user interview, it was nerve-wracking for me. The second time, the third time, the fifth time, too. But then the sixth time, I started to get more confident. And now I've done so many user interviews that I actually really look forward to doing them. And I'm really excited about learning about what our users think, how they use a certain product. So, this feeling of feeling comfortable, that comes with time. You have to allow time to do that. But there are some things that you can already do during your first interview that will help you feel more at ease and that will help you make your interviewee feel more at ease. And the first thing that you want to do is to create a safe space. What I mean with that is that when you're talking to your users, oftentimes you also want them to give you feedback about a product or a feature that you're working on. And they have to feel comfortable to share maybe criticism also with you. So, what you want to do is you want to create a safe environment. And you do that by always encouraging them to be honest, to share their honest thoughts with you. And what helps is to say, hey, listen, I'm here to do this interview with you, but please be as open as you can with me. I won't be offended if you have any criticism. Feel free to share any negative feedback and make sure to restate that during the interview so that they feel confident that they can share things with you. Another thing that you want to do, and this is very important, is if you want to record your interview, be it with video or audio, is that you always ask for permission first. So you need to have the permission of the participant before you hit record. And also make sure to explain why you need the recording. So I oftentimes say, and this is true, that I like to have the recording so that I can watch it back later on and I can now focus on just our interview so that I'm not distracted. I don't have to take notes. I can just focus on the conversation. And it's also really good to tell your users what you will do with these recordings. So, who will see these recordings? If you're planning to show maybe some snippets of the interview to management, then you have to communicate this transparently so that people know what will happen with their data. Now, before you start the interview, you want to explain the goal to your participants. So, why is this person here today? Why are you there? What are you trying to find out through your interview? And also give the person the space to ask any questions if the goal isn't clear yet. Now, I already said this before, but I'm going to say it again because it is a sneaky thing that happens fast, is avoid assumptions. Always ask why. Even if it makes you feel like you're asking a very obvious question or you already think that you know what your participants think. Always ask why. Never assume anything. And like I already said before, use the key questions as a guide, but also allow the conversation to progress naturally. And one thing that I really struggled with in the beginning was that I would have written my key questions and then I would be really anxious to think, oh, did I maybe forget one question or did I already ask this or not? Relax. It's okay. It's totally fine if you skip a question because afterwards, when you have another look on your interview guide, you can say, hey, I meant to ask you this or that. So don't hold on to the order of questions too much. Allow for this natural rhythm of the conversation to happen. And then this also links to avoiding assumptions is to react neutral. So what we tend to do as humans in order to empathize with the person in front of us is to say, oh yeah, I have the same thing, or oh, I agree, that's horrible, or oh no, I don't agree with that at all. And that is something that you want to avoid, because we do want to empathize with the person that we're interviewing, but we don't want to judge what they're saying. And this is something that takes a little bit of practice, because you really have to suppress that urge to say, oh, yeah, I have the same thing, just like you. Oh, I agree with that. Instead, when someone says something, you can say, oh, okay, what makes you think like that? Why was that? What was your experience? So try to avoid this, what would feel like building a connection, and just try to be react very neutral. Now, I already shared some of the things that I struggled with a lot when I started doing user interviews, but I wanted to share a few more of my mistakes so that hopefully you can learn from them. And the most important thing was that I really pressured myself to finish this interview fast. I would just race through the questions, and that can also be a bit of nervousness, that you're so eager to do everything right that you're starting to speed up your voice, that you're starting to race through your interview guide. And the thing is that it's really good to just take some time, even if to you it feels very unnatural to speak that slow, or to really take your time through the interview. That's totally fine. It's fine, just like in conversation. When you're having a conversation with your friend, you're also not trying to speed through the conversation and end the conversation fast. You want to really understand what your friend is saying. You want to dig deeper, and you want to keep that conversation going. Another thing that I tended to do, and I have to say, I still struggle with this, is that when you're doing a user interview, you're so focused on what this other person is saying that you may be skipping some questions, or you might think, oh, I already asked this, so I don't have to ask that. Or, well, this person already kind of answered my question, so I'm just going to skip this question. And the problem with that is that when later on you want to derive insights from your user interview, you might think, oh, why did we not ask this question? Or why did we skip this? Or we're now actually missing some more depth of what our participant was telling us. So it's always fine to just ask things twice, to repeat yourself, or just to say by the end of the interview, hey, thank you so much. I'm going to take some time to go through my interview guide and see if I might have skipped something. So allow yourself this time. That is totally fine. Allow it yourself to um, repeat a question if you didn't really catch the answer. That's totally fine. And then something that I already said before, but I cannot repeat it enough, is to treat your interview guide, don't treat that like a script. I did that too in the beginning, and I think that that is also something that will happen a lot, because you're still not having that much experience with interviewing people. So your interview guide is like the place to hold you above water. But as time progresses, try to let go of that script and try to follow it more as a conversation. Now, I shared a lot of information. Let's just recap before we go into our live interview. So, what I started with is you want to start with a research goal, which is the purpose of your research. Why are you conducting this user interview? Then you want to define a couple of research questions. These are the things that you intend to learn. And both your research goal and your research questions inspire the key questions. And the key questions should be around 5 to 10 questions that are the most important things that you want to ask your user when you're interviewing this person. And while you're writing an interview guide, what you want to try is to write outlines, make sure that your key questions reflect the research goal and the research questions. You want to make sure that you have time to ask follow-up questions, and you want to make sure that the questions that you ask are open questions and they're not leading questions. Now, while you're interviewing the person, you want to make sure that it feels like a natural conversation. You use your interview guide as a guide, not as a script, and you try to really ask why many times and react neutral. So we're going to test that, to demonstrate that with a live user interview. And for this, we have an imaginary dating app called CareerFoundry. And CareerFoundry is a dating app for people that are working in tech. So I already defined a few research goals for this, which is we want to understand how people in tech meet new people and especially potential love interests. So that is one goal. Another goal is that we want to understand how people in tech use apps and social networks to meet new people. And then we want to uncover the biggest pain points in the experience of using dating apps. And we want to uncover the expectations that people might have when using dating apps. The research questions, so the things that we want to learn, is how do our users use dating apps? Why do they use dating apps? What are the biggest pain points that our users face when they use dating apps? What are the biggest benefits? And how can our CareerFoundry dating app support our users' lifestyle and goals? So, based on these research goals and questions, I formulated 4 key questions. And the key questions are: what role do dating apps play in your life? How do you use dating apps? What expectations do you have from dating apps? And then lastly, what are the biggest pain points? And what I'm trying to find out with these key questions is how do our users use dating apps within the bigger context of their lifestyle? What kind of role do dating apps play? And how can we better support them to find a potential love interest? Now, I cannot do this interview by myself, so we will have a special guest, and that is Callum. Callum was very courageous today to be our guinea pig. And as a side note, is that for this interview, because we only have limited time, I'll be focusing more on the technical part of the interview. So I will not be focusing as much on the motivations, because I'm sure that Callum has some interesting dating stories, but I'm also sure that he won't want to share that with everyone. So for the sake of this interview, we'll be focusing more on the usage and the UX of the dating apps. So let me go back here. Callum, if you're ready, then I can do the interview with you.
Yeah, sure. Hey
Cool.
everyone, my name is Callum. I'm the video team lead here at CareerFoundry, and yeah, looking forward to this. I think I maybe drew the short straw of tonight, but I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so I will start the interview as I would start it any other user interview. So from now on, imagine that I'm just doing a user interview with Callum. So, Callum, thank you so much for joining this user interview today. My name is Maureen. I am a product designer and I'm working for CareerFoundry. And the goal of our conversation today is to find out how our users use dating apps and how CareerFoundry can support them with that. So I will ask you a few generic questions first, and afterwards I'll ask you a bit more specific questions. But before we jump into this interview, I would like to ask you if it's okay for you if I record the interview. That is for private purposes, only for me to watch back, and so that we can now focus on the conversation. No one else will see the recordings. Um, so if that's fine for you,
Yeah, that's
I will
absolutely
hit
fine.
record. And now, as note to the audience, I would now hit record. And Callum, if you don't have any questions for me, then I would suggest we just jump right in.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I just want to say I love the name. It's great. Love Foundry. Really catchy.
Um, so, as a note to the audience, what I would normally start the user interview with are a few generic questions to make my user feel at ease, to create a safe space, and to kind of understand the bigger context in which they are. So, Callum, I would like to ask you throughout this interview to be as honest and open as possible with me. You won't offend anything on me if you have any criticism about Law Foundry. And of course, if you don't feel comfortable answering a question, then just let me know and we'll skip the question.
Yeah, sure.
Um, what I first would like to ask you is how do you, in general, meet new people? I know that you moved to Berlin, so how do you meet new people here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's probably changed a lot in the last year and a half for obvious reasons. It's maybe better to split that because traditionally, before the world events of the last year and a half, I would meet most new people, whether maybe socially or romantically, I guess, at things like events and meetups, whether it was through work or through kind of after work activities. So I would do a lot of meetups and go to a lot of events.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, also kind of places that I would frequent. Maybe it was like bars or cafes. You know, you'd strike up conversations with people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's changed a lot, obviously, in the last year and a half. So now I think things have shifted to kind of the digital space, particularly like events and meetups, but also the increased use in like dating apps and things like that, which we're covering today. So it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
split, but yeah, more in the digital space nowadays.
And what would you say, because you mentioned that during the pandemic, it changed for you how you meet new people. So, what would you say were the challenges that you faced in meeting new people before the pandemic and now during the pandemic?
Well, I'm also based in Berlin, and as you know, like Berlin's a pretty big city. So I think some of the challenges are just things like geography, getting from
Mhm.
one side of the city to meet someone again, whether socially or romantically. Yeah, the geography can play a big part in that if they're based in a different district or on the other side of the city. And obviously things like the lockdown and stuff, obviously like the space that you could actually meet and interact with has changed fundamentally in the last year and a half. So yeah, I
Mhm.
think those would be some of the challenges of the present situation.
So you said in the before the pandemic, what challenges you is just the geography, that is the distance that makes it harder to meet people, and now, of course, makes it even more hard because you can't meet people personally.
Yeah, that makes me sound a little bit lazy, but yeah, I think the geography was a big part.
So, Callum, I would like to ask a few more questions connected to dating. So, could you tell me how you approach dating in general? What do you think about it? How do you feel about that?
That's a tough one. I would say I was quite sporadic with dating. I would say it's kind of a passive activity, pastime.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was a hugely active dater these
Hmm.
days, but yeah, I find it can be quite time consuming. And like you mentioned earlier when you were talking to the audience, an introvert, I would say I'm quite extroverted. Like I get energy from being around other people, but I think particularly with dating, that can draw quite a lot of energy from you, particularly in like a first date scenario, you know, like you put on a certain type of I guess like a face when you meet someone for the first time, based on like first impressions and things. So yeah, I think that would be kind of, I don't know if that answers your question, sorry, my approach
Yeah.
to dating, but yeah, I'm quite passive with it. And
What makes you passive with it? Why is that?
I think I'm just quite sporadic with it, and it's not like I have scheduled times where I'm like, oh hey, I've not been on a date in a while, I need to fix that. It's yeah, it just kind of comes and goes, you know. But yeah, I don't know, I don't really have much more to expand on, unfortunately. I'm just yeah, kind of passive background. I'm a background dater. It's like a
So, as a note to the audience now, is that and in cases like this, when a user says, "Oh, I don't know, that's just how it is," this would be a good point to ask why even more, because oftentimes people do have a motivation, but they just don't have it at hand. So, what I would ask on this part, we're not going to go too deep in this right now, but what questions you could ask right now is, what are the beliefs, or you say that you get a bit lazy and passive with it. What makes you think it's passive? And these kind of questions help you understand the mindset that our users is in. So you will have situations during your user interviews where people say, "Oh, that's just the way it is," or "Oh, I don't know, that's just what I do." And those are challenging points because you tend to think, okay, well, then that's just how this person is. But these are the points where you can really dig deeper and you kind of have to guide the person. That's what I said before. You need to steer them and let them do the talking by asking some probing questions. So that this would be a good point to ask that. And before I ask these dating questions, as again, note to the audience, is because I want to know the beliefs around dating. And this might sound a bit fluffy or fuzzy, but the reason why I want to understand this is because the mindset that people come to use your product with really say a lot about how they will experience it. There is a big difference between someone that says, "Oh, I love using dating apps. They give me lots of energy. I use them all the time. I've met so many cool people." And someone that says, "Oh, I'm using dating apps when I'm bored or I feel a bit lonely and I'm on the toilet, so I need 5 minutes of entertainment." Those are two different mindsets. So that's what you also want to find out. Okay, so now after we have covered the bigger context, we want to dig a little bit deeper. And so for this particular interview, I will focus more on the UX of dating apps. So, Callum, maybe you could tell me, what role do dating apps play in your life?
It's an interesting question. I think it's definitely come a long way from, like, for online dating. I think it's definitely come a long way from the days of like eHarmony and Match.com. Not that I ever used these kind of browsing dating apps. I have friends that have, but definitely I think the apps sort of fit the time that we're in just now. So for a lot of people, it's kind of a convenient time saver. You know, you can get this app out on your phone and potentially strike up conversations with interesting people while you wait for the bus or you're walking to work. You know, so I think it's kind of a convenient time saver. So I would say, yeah, I think they just represent the times that we live in currently.
So you mentioned this before, and you mentioned it again, that you connect saving time and convenience with dating apps. So is that also does that tell something about how you feel about dating apps? Is this convenience important to you?
I think so, yeah. And just to touch on the thing you mentioned to the audience previously about digging a little deeper, like I think when I mentioned that it wasn't a huge part of my I don't know, a huge like priority for me. I think it is a time thing. Like I think, I don't know, I think given the geography of Berlin and, you know, distances that you have to travel, it can be quite exhausting. And, you know, spending an hour on a train or a bus to get somewhere to then meet someone and then come back. And it's, yeah. So I think maybe it is about time and saving time and energy in that respect.
So as a note to the audience, what Callum is saying here is very interesting because remember, Love Foundry is a app for people working in tech, and what Callum says here is, oh, dating apps, they're convenient because they're time saving. So this might already give us a hint of what our users that are people working in tech might find important. They might not have the time to spend on going out, meeting people, or clubbing. So the saving time component might be very important for them. And if this interview would be taking longer, I would ask Callum more questions about that, because that is something that, as a designer, I want to know more about. How can we help you save time? How can Love Foundry app help you save time? So, Callum, you already told me that there are particular moments that you use the dating apps is when you're waiting for the bus. It's because you want to save time. And when we talked in private, you already mentioned to me that you used Hinge. So I want to learn more about your experience with Hinge. Could you tell me a bit more about how your experience using the app was?
Yeah, I think it was recommended to me by a friend
Mm-hmm.
last year, and it was kind of the new kid on the block in terms of dating apps at the time, or at least in Germany, in Berlin. And unlike previous apps that I'd used, like Bumble and Tinder, it just felt a bit more personable. Like it felt like there was a bigger emphasis on building a connection with someone. And also, it wasn't one of these kind of card swiping left or right style apps. It was a bit more, you were kind of presented a profile of someone one at a time, you know, and you kind of engage with that profile a bit more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
So it felt a bit more meaningful in a way.
So that's interesting. You said you want to save time, but now you mention what you do like about using Hinge is that it gives you a more personalized experience, and it's not just swiping left or right as in Tinder, but you interact, or you're more encouraged to interact more deeply with profiles. So would you say that that is important to you when you use a dating app?
Yeah, I think it's yeah, it's about forging a more meaningful connection, right? You know, if you're time strapped, you don't want to necessarily go on lots of dates where there's no connection with the person and there's a bad fit. So I think definitely being able to have a stronger connection or a more meaningful interaction before you actually meet, perhaps, is again maybe a bit of a time saver ultimately.
Mhm. And as a note to the audience, what I oftentimes try to do in user interview is to restate what my interviewee is telling me. And I do this for two reasons. One, to check if I understand correctly what my interviewee said. And second, to let my interviewee know that I'm actively listening to this person. And in this case, if we would have more time, this would be a really interesting component to dig deeper in, because what Callum is basically telling me is I want to have quality in limited time. I don't have much time, so I want to have few good matches instead of going through hundreds of matches that are just so. So, Callum, what are the things that you liked about using the Hinge app? You already told me some. Are there other things that you liked about using that app?
Yeah, a number of things actually. It always felt less gamified. I know apps like
Mm-hmm.
Tinder and Bumble, you have different kind of upsells and super likes and boosts and all this kind of thing. I think Hinge felt a bit more serious and a bit more adult.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it felt less gamified. And as I mentioned, it felt like it had a more human element to it, you know. So I know all these apps are designed to make money, but it definitely felt like they were more like one of their taglines is, we hope you delete this app and find someone that's, or it's phrased differently, but I think that's the main selling point. Like they
Mm-hmm.
sell it as like the last app you'll ever need kind of thing, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
it definitely feels like they're on a mission to make connections, whereas I feel like Tinder is about, things like user retention and engagement.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
You said gamified. Could you explain this a bit more? Why does it feel gamified to you?
Sorry, so Hinge doesn't feel gamified.
Oh, okay.
I was just comparing it with the other ones. Sorry. So I think Hinge just feels a little bit more serious, whereas when
Mm-hmm.
you use apps like Bumble and Tinder, there's all these kind of like cartoonish upsells and almost like they look
Mhm.
like power ups in Mario Kart or something, you know. So
Mhm.
it just feels a bit more serious, I think.
So, what I take from what you're saying is it makes Hinge feels more serious to you because you don't have these power ups or super boosts.
Yeah, it just feels a bit more focused on the actual task at hand, which is like building connections between people and
Hmm.
allowing people to meet up and date. Whereas I think the other ones just feel more about making money, and it's kind of it looks very much like it's geared towards
Mm.
that.
Okay, so what I take from that is that also you want to feel like this app helps you make a connection rather than takes your money from you.
This is it. This is it. You mentioned earlier it was all about quality, definitely.
Hmm. Okay. And what are the things that you did not like that much about using the Hinge app?
I think like most of the dating apps, there's definitely limitations on use. I think
Hmm.
even Hinge has these kind of like paywall structures. So you
Hmm.
have like a free version, and then there's a version that you can pay for, and then another version that gives you more features.
Hmm.
And I think I dislike that, and I know it's natural for companies to have these different features to make money, but I think with Hinge, it kind of strips away what I just mentioned, where it feels quite serious. That does kind of chip away at that experience.
Hmm. Um, if how would you say could the experience using Hinge be improved?
Um, I think maybe just a bit more transparency about how many profiles you can engage with, like maybe a counter on the side or something. It always feels like you reach a paywall suddenly, or
Hmm.
like some kind of blocker for the free accounts.
Hmm.
So maybe a bit more transparency about things like that, I think would help.
Hmm. Okay. Um, I will only ask you as a note to the audience, I will only ask Callum one last question, but I just want to reiterate to what we just said. So what might be really helpful when you're doing an interview is to ask for very specific things. So if I would ask Callum, um, what is your experience with dating apps, then that doesn't really give him a time frame or a specific moment to remember. And this is hard for people when you ask them very generic questions in an interview. They don't know which memory to pick. So what I would suggest is that when you have an interview, ask for specific things. What do you think of the Hinge app? Can you tell me the last time you used a dating app? Can you tell me how many times did you use a dating app in the past month? That makes it more concrete for our users. Now, normally, I would also ask more about competitors, how they compare with each other, what my users think about the competitors, what they like about it, what they don't like about it. And then, what I always like to do to end the interview is to ask what I call the magic wand question. And I will ask that Callum now. So, Callum, we talked a bit about dating apps. Now, to close our interview, imagine that you would have a magic wand and you could wish whatever to improve your experience with dating apps. What would you wish for?
That's a really tough question, actually. And maybe I'll give you an answer that's not one that's uniquely personal to me, but
Mhm.
more for my friends that are women that are using the apps. But I definitely think improved safety features.
Mhm.
So I think I read somewhere that it was either maybe Tinder or Bumble were rolling out a feature which meant that um, women couldn't receive unsolicited messages if it was flagged as being a bit creepy or weird.
Mhm.
And I thought that was a really cool feature. And I know currently in the current global situation, social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube can flag up content that has, for example, keywords like pandemic or vaccine and things. It
Mhm.
can flag up with like a warning sign. So I definitely think if those apps can do that, then they can be maybe a bit more proactive with their safety features for particularly women users in my
Mhm.
experience. Um, yeah, just based on stories I've heard from friends and things. So that would maybe be one of the features I would try and improve so that
Mhm.
people can use these apps in a sort of safer manner and feel less maybe intimidated by them.
Mhm.
That's not maybe uniquely a personal experience for myself, but I'm not sure. Hopefully that helps.
Mhm. The reason why, and this is again to my audience, the reason why I like to ask this question by the end of the conversation is because it gives the users a chance to share any ideas for improvements with me, or it gives them the space to share anything that we didn't touch upon. So, what Callum mentioned here is safety features. Now, if I would actually be working for Law Foundry, then that would be a very important hint for us, something that we should focus our apps on. But for now, I'm going to close off the interview. So I will say, Callum, thank you so much for your time today. And if you have any questions, let us know. I really enjoyed the interview and you gave me a lot of insights. So thank you for that.
That's
And
great. And yeah, thanks to you, Maureen, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. I'll disappear now, but yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
thank you, Callum. All right. So that was a very short user interview. Of course, in 15, 20 minutes, we cannot cover everything, but hopefully this gave you some insight on how I go about doing user interviews. And I see that we're a little bit over time, but I hope that we still have a bit more time for questions. Jakob, let me know if there are any questions, and then we can answer those. So
there are muted. Yes, there are quite a few questions. So first of all, quite a few compliments about your listening skills. So maybe we could start with that. How can you recommend ways to practice your listening skills?
I can recommend a book for that, and the book is called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. And the good thing with this book is that it teaches you how to actively listen to the other. And this book is not made for UX designers, but it is very helpful because it helps UX designers to identify fears that people might have. And this nonviolent communication helps you to communicate in conflict situations, but also it really helps me user interviews to restate what another person is saying, to understand if I got the message right. Because oftentimes we assume we know what another person is saying, but we understand them wrong. So always restate what another person said in your own words and then say, is this what you were trying to say?
Fantastic, thank you. So let's get to the questions. And if you have any questions, just post them in the Q&A chat, and of course use that upvote button so we can ask your favorite ones. Here's one about eye tracking. How can we conduct eye tracking user testing? Are there any particular toolkits or applications to do that?
I know that there are agencies that are specialized in eye tracking. I personally never used this, so I cannot recommend a tool for you because I don't have experience with it. But I learned that a lot of specialized user research agencies oftentimes use this. So if you have questions about that, I would suggest that you reach out to one of these agencies in your area, and maybe they can give you some tips on that, on what they use, or maybe you can already see that on the website, how they do that.
Thank you. And why 5 people would be considered the correct amount of people to interview?
This is a controversial thing because the standard is what we use in UX design is that we oftentimes say 5 people are enough, because with 5 people, you cover 80% or 75% of all the insights. And the more people that you interview, the more you will see a pattern, but you will get less new insights. So oftentimes 5 people is enough. However, I start to notice that in more and more interviews that I do, we actually tend to interview more people. And the reason for that is that the landscape that our users live in right now is way more complex than it was when this research by Annan Group was conducted. So Annan Group did a research and they said, okay, 5 people is enough to cover most insights. However, this research is already from a different time, so it's gotten way more complex. So, for example, recently I did a user interview with 10 people. Now, I would say that's a lot. Like, I would say that the last 2 people, we could have also skipped that. But if you have the chance to interview 7 people, for example, that is already a good compromise.
Thank you. How can I know or notice if I'm asking the right questions when conducting a user interview?
You can read the attitude of the person. So if you can try to read the body language, if someone like nods, goes like this, or is like this, you can already tell, okay, there is something there. Maybe I might need to dig a little bit deeper, or maybe I just gotten too personal. And what I would also always say is that when you've written your interview guide, get it checked by other colleagues, because what you might think are good key questions, maybe you can talk with a colleague that also knows the business objectives and gives you a new perspective. So always check with your colleagues when it's about your interview guide. And then during the interview, try to read the body language of someone to understand, should I ask more about this, or is this something that a person doesn't want to talk about?
And is there a golden rule for how many questions we should be asking during user interviews?
So like I said, I would go for 5 to 10 key questions, and then like I said before, try to keep the conversation natural. So if you feel like there is one thing that is particularly interesting, so in the example with Callum, I would ask him more about this contradiction between wanting to have quality matches, but also wanting to save time. That would be a point where I would be asking more follow-up questions. So use as many follow-up questions as you need, but try to limit the key questions to 5 to 10 questions.
And I just love this question about how do you find people to interview by yourself, or do you write on third party for recruiting? And maybe here, because you're one of our graduates, so maybe you could start with actually how you interviewed people and recruited them during your bootcamp.
Exactly.
And then how you recruit people at your current position.
Exactly. So when I was studying at CareerFoundry, of course, I don't have any money to use any recruitment services. So what I would do is, after I written down my research goals and questions, I would try to find the natural habitat of my people. So for example, I did a project on expats, and so I would reach out to expat groups in Berlin. You had internations, there are expat groups on Reddit, on Facebook, and I would try to find people there. So I would just write a forum post on internations saying, hey, I'm wanting to conduct user interviews for expats. Is there someone living in Berlin that would be interested? And then I would give my requirements, must be age X between X, speak German, or whatever your requirements might be. So try to find the natural habitat of your users. And then right now, if you work at a company, you'll oftentimes find that they actually use recruitment services for that. Or right now at Zalando, we even have a research coordinator. So I will tell her what kind of users I'm looking for, and then she will get in touch with these people. So you have the luck that when you work at a company, the screening part is actually taken out of your hands. In many cases, not always, but in many cases, as far as I've experienced, I never had to do the screening myself.
Yes, thank you. Maybe we have time for another few questions. How to bring back the focus when an interview is too often goes on and on?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And that really tends to happen because when a interviewee gets very passionate or worked up, they're just going to derail the conversation. And there again, like I said, you're there to steer. So you can, it's totally fine to say, thank you, I would like to bring the focus back to, and then you repeat the question that you were meant to ask. So don't be shy to say that. Say, okay, thanks. With the eye on the time, I would like to bring our focus back to, and then you repeat your question.
Do you have any favorite tools for interviews and transcripts?
So at Zalando, we just use Google Meet. You don't need to use any fancy programs for doing user interviews remote. We just use Google Meet. We write our notes in Google Sheets. That's where our note taker also writes everything down. And in my previous jobs, we used Teams or Zoom. So you don't need any fancy tools, any kind of meeting tool that you already am familiar with, that's totally fine to use.
And maybe the last question, and I just love this one. Does users' personality matter in the interview? If we interview same type of people, for example, introverts, how can we know the view of extroverts?
I think what is very important here is to really have the screening requirements of your users correct. So oftentimes when we're doing user interviews, I'm mostly interested in a certain type of user. I'm not too concerned if this person is an introvert or an extrovert. Sometimes it does matter, the personality does matter in the interview, because if we're talking to someone that is extremely shy or private or reserved, it's very hard to get to this person because they simply will not answer your question, or they will only say yes and no. And in that case, what I said before, and this takes a bit of courage, but ask why, don't give up, try to dig deeper and try to create a safe environment. So throughout your user interviews, you will talk with many different people. Some you just have to give the microphone, they will talk for 60 minutes straight. You almost don't have to ask a question. And other people, you really have to pull out the answers. But that is why it is important that you have this interview guide and that you feel confident to ask more follow-up questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maureen. Thank you, Callum, if you're still there in the background. And thank you all for attending and learning with us today. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions about our UX or UI programs, just reach out to one of our program advisors and they will be very, very happy to help you. And with that, I wish you a very good morning, good evening, wherever you're based, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.